The smell of old paper and lemon oil hung thick in the Pembroke Public Library on the morning of March 9th, 1984, when Emma Hartley realized she had exactly 72 hours to save the only place that had ever felt like home. The town council's decision could erase everything. Emma stood behind the circulation desk, her fingers trailing across the worn oak surface her grandmother had polished for 30 years before her. At 28, she'd returned to Pembroke, Maine after her mother's death, trading a promising career in Boston for the quiet rhythm of stamping due dates and shelving returns. The townspeople saw her as they always had, the shy Hartley girl who spoke more to books than people, whose beauty was wasted behind thick reading glasses and cardigans that belonged to someone's grandmother. They didn't see her at all, really. Just a fixture, like the card catalog or the creaking floorboards. But Emma saw everything. She'd watched the town council meetings from the back row for 6 months, noting how Mayor Douglas Pemberton's jaw tightened whenever Councilman Richard Voss whispered in his ear. She'd observed the way Patricia Sterling, newest council member and owner of Sterling Development, smiled like a shark when discussing municipal efficiency. 3 weeks ago, they'd announced their plan. Close the library, sell the building, use the funds for a new shopping complex that would revitalize downtown. The vote was scheduled for March 12th. Emma had tried speaking at the February meeting, her carefully prepared speech about literacy rates and community spaces delivered in a voice that barely carried past the third row. Patricia Sterling had checked her watch. Mayor Pemberton had thanked her for her quaint concerns. Richard Voss had actually yawned. She was invisible to them. That morning, as weak March sunlight filtered through the tall windows, 7-year-old Michael Chen pushed through the heavy front doors, his backpack dragging behind him. He came every day after school, a quiet boy whose parents worked double shifts at the textile mill. Emma had been teaching him to read beyond his grade level, watching him devour everything from mythology to space exploration. "Miss Emma?" His voice was small. "Tyler Voss said his dad's gonna tear down the library. Is that true?" Emma knelt to his level, adjusting his crooked glasses, a gesture she'd performed 100 times. "I'm working on it, sweetheart. But where will I go? After school, I mean. Mom doesn't get home until 6. The question landed like a stone in still water. Emma had no answer, so she did what she always did. She offered a book. "Want to help me with something special today? I'm going through the archive room, and I could use an assistant." The archive room occupied the library's northeast corner, a space most patrons forgot existed. Boxes of town records, donated collections, and forgotten acquisitions filled floor-to-ceiling shelves. Emma had been searching through them for weeks, desperate for anything that might help her case. That afternoon, while Michael sorted through old newspapers nearby, Emma opened a leather-bound journal she'd almost overlooked. The cover was unmarked, the pages brittle with age. Inside, the handwriting was elegant but fading. Personal Observations of Josiah Pembroke, 1796 to 1803. Josiah Pembroke, the town's founder. Her heart began to race. She'd studied Pembroke's published letters in college, standard historical fare about settlement and commerce. But this was different, personal, raw. She flipped through pages describing crop failures, disputes with neighboring towns, the death of his first wife. Then, on a page dated June 14th, 1799, she found it. A single paragraph that would change everything. "I have today signed the deed establishing the public reading house upon the eastern hill, with the provision that said structure shall remain in perpetuity for the use of free learning, never to be sold or purposed otherwise, as my final gift to the generations who will build upon the foundation we lay." Let no future authority forget that a town's greatest wealth lies not in commerce, but in the preserved wisdom of those who came before. Emma's hands trembled. She read it again and again. Michael appeared at her elbow. "Miss Emma, you're crying. Did you find something sad?" She laughed through the tears, pulling the boy into a quick hug. "No, sweetheart. I found something that's going to make a lot of very important people very uncomfortable." The journal entry was a legal land covenant, forgotten for nearly 2 centuries. If she was reading this correctly, and she'd spent 4 years studying colonial property law, the library couldn't be sold. The building was legally protected by the founder's original deed. The council had no idea. But proving it would mean standing before the same people who'd dismissed her, ignored her, treated her like a decoration in her own workplace. It would mean finding her voice in a room designed to silence people like her. Emma closed the journal carefully, her mind already racing through what came next. She needed to verify the deed, cross-reference with county records, prepare an airtight argument. She had 72 hours. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you want to see how Emma outsmarts an entire town council, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happens next will restore your faith in the power of one quiet voice. Michael tugged her sleeve. "Are we gonna win?" Emma looked at the boy's hopeful face, then down at the journal in her hands. A message from the past, written by a man who'd understood that some things must be protected, no matter the cost. "Yes," she said. "We're going to win." But she had no idea that within 48 hours, she'd discover the real reason the council wanted the library gone, and it had nothing to do with budget efficiency. The Pembroke County Records Office smelled of dust, microfiche chemicals, and the particular staleness of a building where windows hadn't been opened since the Carter administration. Emma needed those original deed records, and she needed them today. She'd left Michael with Mrs. Kowalski next door, the elderly woman who ran the children's reading hour and who'd wept openly when she heard about the closure vote. Now, at 8:30 on the morning of March 10th, Emma stood before a counter where a clerk named Donald Marsh looked at her over bifocals with the expression of someone deeply inconvenienced by her existence. "Deeds from 1799? He sighed like she'd asked him to swim to England. "That's in the basement archives. Handwritten records. Could take days." "I have until Monday." "Well, that's unfortunate timing, isn't it?" Emma recognized the dismissal in his tone, the same one she'd heard her whole life. The shy girl asking for help was easy to ignore, but something had shifted in her since finding that journal. She thought of Michael's question, "Where will I go?" She thought of the 17 other children who treated the library as sanctuary. She thought of her grandmother's hands, smoothing that oak desk for 3 decades. She leaned forward, her voice quiet but steel-threaded. "Mr. Marsh, I'm researching a legal covenant that may invalidate a town council decision affecting public property. If those records aren't available and the decision proceeds, I'll be mentioning in my statement Monday night that the county records office failed to provide legally mandated access to historical documents. I imagine the Portland papers would find that interesting." His eyebrows rose. So did Emma's confidence. 20 minutes later, she was in the basement, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers that chronicled every land transaction in Pembroke's history. The archives were organized by decade, each volume cataloged with the kind of meticulous care that spoke to someone who'd loved their work. Emma ran her fingers along spines until she found it. Land Deeds and Covenants, 1795 to 1805. The pages crackled as she opened them, her heart hammering. She scanned through entries, looking for anything marked with Josiah Pembroke's name. There, June 17th, 1799. 3 days after he'd written his journal entry. Deed of establishment. Public reading house. The formal legal language confirmed what the journal had revealed. The Eastern Hill property was designated in perpetuity for public educational use, with covenant binding upon all future owners, heirs, and municipal authorities. The signature was Josiah Pembroke's, witnessed by 3 town officials. It was ironclad. Emma felt relief flood through her, followed immediately by confusion. If this deed existed in the public record, how had the town council missed it? She flipped forward through the ledger, tracing the property's history. Ownership had transferred to the town in 1823. Various renovations were noted. Then, in 1947, a curious entry. Note: original covenant under review by town solicitor H. Voss regarding municipal expansion project, pending resolution. H. Voss. Emma's blood went cold. Harold Voss, Richard Voss's grandfather, and the review was marked pending, never resolved. She checked the following years. Nothing. The covenant simply disappeared from subsequent records, not formally revoked, but ignored, forgotten, or deliberately buried. The library had been protected all along, but someone had made sure no one remembered. She photographed every relevant page with her pocket camera, her hands steady despite the implications crashing through her mind. This wasn't just about saving the library anymore. This was about uncovering why someone had wanted the protection erased 70 years ago, and why their descendant was pushing so hard to demolish the building now. Back at the library that afternoon, Emma spread her evidence across the reference table. Michael sat nearby, supposedly doing homework, but clearly watching her work with the intense focus of a child who understood something important was happening. "Miss Emma?" His voice was tentative. "Is someone trying to cheat?" The question was so direct, so clear-eyed, that Emma had to smile. "I think so, sweetheart. But we're going to make sure they don't get away with it." The bell above the door chimed. Emma looked up to see Patricia Sterling entering, her designer heels clicking against the old floorboards like a countdown. She was followed by Richard Voss, whose expression reminded Emma of someone inspecting property they'd already purchased. "Emma." Patricia's smile was all polish, no warmth. "I heard you've been doing some research at the county records office. Small towns. Everyone knew everything." "Just routine historical documentation," Emma replied, her voice steady. "How industrious." Richard Voss wandered toward the archive room, his hands clasped behind his back. "You know, my grandfather used to tell stories about this place. Said it was built on swampland, structurally unsound from the start. Shame to preserve something that's falling apart." Emma watched him carefully. He was fishing, trying to gauge what she knew. "Actually, the building's foundation is solid granite, quarried from Pembroke's own hills. Your grandfather would have known that. He was town solicitor when they did the last major renovation in 1947. Something flickered in Richard's eyes. Recognition. Concern. Patricia stepped forward, her tone shifting from condescending to businesslike. "Emma, let's be frank. The council has made its decision. Sterling Development has already drawn up plans for the property. Fighting this will only delay the inevitable and make you look difficult. Surely, you'd like a positive reference for your next position?" The threat was wrapped in silk, but it was still a threat. Michael's pencil had stopped moving. Emma felt his eyes on her, waiting to see if the adults would do what adults always did: compromise, capitulate, choose the easy path. She thought of her grandmother, who'd stood at this same desk through the Depression, the war, the turbulent 60s, who'd never turned away a child looking for sanctuary or knowledge, who'd taught Emma that quiet didn't mean weak. "I appreciate your concern," Emma said, meeting Patricia's gaze without flinching. "But I won't be needing a reference. I'm not going anywhere." Richard Voss's jaw tightened. That same tell she'd observed in council meetings. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe, but it's mine to make." After they left, Michael came to stand beside her. "You were brave." "I was terrified. Same thing sometimes." Wisdom from a 7-year-old. That evening, as Emma locked up the library, she noticed something odd. The archive room door, which she always kept secured, stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open, her stomach sinking. The shelves where she'd found Josiah Pembroke's journal had been ransacked. Boxes pulled down, contents scattered, and the journal itself gone. Someone had been here. Someone who knew exactly what she'd found. Emma stood in the chaos, her evidence stolen, her case suddenly precarious. The council meeting was 48 hours away, and she'd just lost her most powerful weapon. But as she knelt to gather the scattered papers, her hand brushed against something wedged behind a fallen box, a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age, that had apparently fallen from the journal during the theft. She unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, dated June 10th, 1799, written in the same elegant hand as the journal. But this one began, "To my son, that he may understand why some battles must be fought in silence until the moment demands a voice." Emma began to read, and with each word, the true story of the library and the Pembroke family's darkest secret began to reveal itself. Why had Richard Voss's family tried to erase this building's protection 70 years ago? And what were they so desperate to hide? The letter trembled in Emma's hands as she read by the dim light of her desk lamp. The library silent except for the old building's familiar creaks and sighs. This wasn't just history. It was confession. Josiah Pembroke's words, written 2 centuries ago to a son who would never read them, laid bare a truth that powerful families had spent generations trying to bury. Emma's eyes moved across the faded ink, her breath catching as the implications crystallized. "My dearest William, by the time you are old enough to understand these words, I pray the shame I carry will have been transformed into something redemptive. The reading house I established today is not merely a gift to our town. It is penance. For I have learned that my partner in the shipping venture, Samuel Voss, has been transporting human souls in the holds, where we believed only timber and grain traveled. When I confronted him, he showed me the ledgers, the profits that built half this town. He asked what I thought financed our prosperity. I was a fool, or worse, a coward who chose not to see. I cannot undo what my ignorance enabled, but I can ensure that future generations have access to truth, to knowledge, to the kinds of books that teach us to see each other as fully human. Let this building stand as witness to our failures and our hopes. Let no one tear it down, for it is built on confession as much as stone." Emma set the letter down, her hands shaking. The Pembroke fortune, the very name of this town, was built on the slave trade, and the Voss family had been at the center of it. Josiah had tried to make amends through the library, designating it as a protected space for learning and truth. But the Voss family had spent the next 2 centuries trying to erase that protection, to bury the evidence of their origins. No wonder Richard Voss wanted the building demolished. The recognition hit Emma like a physical force. This wasn't about budget constraints or municipal efficiency. This was about erasing the one building whose very existence was a testament to the town's darkest chapter. A chapter the Voss family desperately wanted forgotten. She thought of Richard Voss's grandfather, the solicitor who'd buried the Covenant records in 1947. She thought of how Richard himself had pushed so aggressively for demolition rather than renovation. They weren't just silencing her voice. They were trying to silence history itself. Emma grabbed her coat. It was nearly 10 at night, but there was one person in Pembroke who might help her understand the full scope of what she'd uncovered. Thomas Pembroke lived in the original family homestead on the western edge of town, a man in his 70s who'd spent 40 years teaching history at Pembroke High before retiring. He was a distant cousin, Emma's connection to the founding family so diluted by time and intermarriage that she'd never thought much about it. But Thomas had always been kind to her, had encouraged her love of research and documentation. When she knocked on his door at 10:40 that night, he took one look at her face and ushered her inside. The smell of pipe tobacco and old books filled his study, every wall lined with volumes on Maine history, colonial records, genealogical charts. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm shadows across photographs of Pembroke through the centuries. "You found something," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Emma laid the letter on his desk, along with the photographs she'd taken at the records office. She watched his face as he read, saw the grief and recognition move across his weathered features. "I always wondered if any record had survived," he said quietly. "My father hinted at it once when I was young, said the library was special, that it carried a debt. But he never explained, and after he died, I could never find proof." "You knew about the slavery connection?" "Suspected. Enough pieces over the years. Shipping records that didn't quite add up, whispers in old letters, the way certain families reacted whenever anyone tried to dig into pre-1800 history." Thomas looked up at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Emma, do you understand what you're holding? This isn't just about saving a building. This is about forcing this town to confront what it's been built on." The weight of it settled over her shoulders. She'd thought she was fighting to save a library. Now she was standing at the edge of exposing a conspiracy of silence that had lasted 200 years. "The council meeting is Monday night," she said. "Richard Voss stole Josiah's journal, probably thinking it was the only evidence. But they don't know about this letter. If I present it, they'll destroy you." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. "Emma, the Voss family has money, influence, connections to state politicians. Patricia Sterling's development company has already invested hundreds of thousands in preliminary work. The mayor owes his election to their campaign contributions. You're a 28-year-old librarian with no political power, no wealthy backers, no leverage except a 200-year-old letter and your own courage. Then I guess courage will have to be enough." Thomas studied her for a long moment, then moved to a locked cabinet. He pulled out a file box, its contents carefully preserved in archival sleeves. "My father collected these over his lifetime. He never knew what to do with them. Wasn't brave enough to bring them to light, but couldn't bring himself to destroy them either." He handed her the box. "Shipping manifests from Samuel Voss's company, 1803 to 1821. You'll see the notation system, timber, that was sold for prices no timber ever commanded. Cargo that required food and water provisions listed separately. Evidence. Documentation. The paper trail that proved the Voss fortune was built on human bondage." Emma's hands closed around the box. Why are you giving this to me? Because you're asking the question my father was too afraid to ask. What good is preserving history if we only preserve the comfortable parts? Thomas smiled sadly. And because I've watched you with those kids at the library. You fight for them like they're your own. That's the kind of person who can be trusted with truth. Emma returned to the library near midnight, the file box secured in her arms. She let herself in through the back entrance, switching on only the small lamp at her desk. The archive room still showed signs of the earlier ransacking, but she didn't have time to clean it now. She had 36 hours to prepare a presentation that would either save the library or end her career in this town. She was laying out documents on the reference table when she heard it, a soft sound from the children's section. Her heart jumped. Someone was in the building. "Michael?" she called out, though she knew it couldn't be him at this hour. A figure emerged from between the shelves. Patricia Sterling, still dressed in her business suit. Her expression harder than Emma had ever seen it. "You should have taken my advice," Patricia said, "about not fighting the inevitable." Emma straightened, grateful that she'd left the most damaging documents in the box behind her desk. "How did you get in?" "I have friends on the town council. Getting a key wasn't difficult." Patricia moved closer, her heels clicking ominously. "Emma, I'm going to be direct, because I think you're smarter than you pretend to be. The Sterling Development Project isn't just a shopping complex. We have investors, serious investors from Boston, people who don't like delays or complications. They're expecting to break ground in May, on property that's legally protected by a piece of paper from 1799 that no one remembers and no one cares about." Patricia's smile was cold. "You think people in this town are going to rally around the memory of Josiah Pembroke once they learn what his shipping company was really transporting? You think they'll thank you for dragging up ugly history that makes everyone uncomfortable?" So they knew. Of course they knew. "I think," Emma said carefully, "that people deserve to know the truth about where they come from, even when it's painful. That's very noble, also very naive." Patricia leaned against the circulation desk, her grandmother's desk, with casual ownership that made Emma's blood boil. "Here's what's going to happen. You'll go to the council meeting Monday, and you'll withdraw your opposition. In exchange, Sterling Development will fund a new, modern library in the shopping complex. Better facilities, better technology, better everything. The children you care so much about will have something actually worth preserving. And the building? This building? Demolished, clean slate. Everyone moves forward." A bribe wrapped in progress. Emma almost admired the elegance of it. "And if I refuse?" Patricia's expression turned pitying. "Then we'll make sure every person in this town knows that you prioritized an old building over their economic future. That you wanted to keep them trapped in poverty to preserve some romantic notion of history. Richard has contacts at the paper. By Tuesday morning, you'll be the villain who tried to hold Pembroke back." Emma felt the trap closing around her. They'd thought of everything. The practical argument, the emotional manipulation, the threat of public shame. Fighting them meant becoming the enemy of the very community she was trying to serve. But then she thought of Josiah Pembroke, writing his confession by candlelight. He'd had everything to lose too: reputation, legacy, the respect of his son. But he'd chosen truth anyway, had built this library as a monument to the idea that facing our failures was the only path to redemption. She thought of her grandmother, serving this community through wars and recessions, never turning away a single soul who needed help. She thought of Michael, asking where he would go. No, Emma said quietly. I won't withdraw. Patricia's expression hardened. Then you've made your choice. I hope it was worth it. After she left, Emma stood alone in the silent library, surrounded by 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge and stories. Tomorrow, she would have to prepare for a battle she might not win. But tonight, she allowed herself one moment of absolute certainty. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. Especially then. Outside, a cold March wind rattled the old windows, and somewhere in the darkness, people were already planning how to silence one woman's voice before it could speak the truth that would change everything. The Pembroke diner smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and the particular anxiety that comes from knowing everyone is talking about you. Emma had barely slept, but she needed breakfast, and she refused to hide. It was Saturday morning, March 11th, 36 hours until the council meeting. She slid into a booth near the window, aware of the conversations that paused when she entered, the glances that darted away when she looked up. News traveled fast in small towns, and somehow word had spread that the quiet librarian was causing trouble. Marlene, the owner who'd served Emma countless grilled cheese sandwiches through childhood, approached with the coffee pot. Her smile was strained. Emma, honey, how are you holding up? I'm fine, Marlene. Just the usual, please. Marlene poured coffee with hands that shook slightly. Listen, I don't know what you've got yourself into, but Richard Voss was in here yesterday saying some things about you trying to block progress, hurt the town's economy. She lowered her voice. People are worried about their jobs, sweetheart. The mill's been laying off workers. Sterling Development promised employment for at least 50 locals. Emma's stomach twisted. So it was already starting. The campaign to paint her as the enemy. Marlene, did you know that the library serves 73 children every week? That 12 of them have no other safe place to go after school while their parents work? I know, honey, I do. Marlene's eyes were sympathetic but worried. But 50 jobs is 50 families with food on the table. You can see how folks might weigh that differently. After Marlene left, Emma stared into her coffee, feeling the impossible weight of the choice she was forcing people to make. Keep a library or feed your family, preserve history or survive the present. She was asking this town to care about principles when they were struggling with basic needs. Mind if I sit? Emma looked up to find Thomas Pembroke standing beside her booth, his weathered coat dusted with the morning's light snow. He settled across from her without waiting for an answer. You look like someone who's just realized what being right actually costs, he said gently. They're going to hate me. Even if I win, I'll have made them choose between conscience and survival. Welcome to every moral battle worth fighting. Thomas signaled for coffee. 1863, when the Pembroke family finally acknowledged publicly what their fortune was built on, half the town stopped speaking to my great-grandfather. People whose livelihoods depended on Pembroke money suddenly had to confront uncomfortable truths. My great-grandfather lived the last 20 years of his life essentially exiled in his own town. Emma felt tears threaten. How did he stand it? He had something more important than popularity. He had purpose. Thomas pulled a folded newspaper from his coat. This morning's Portland Press Herald, page 4. Emma unfolded it to find an article. Maine town faces historic preservation battle. Library at center of development dispute. The piece was surprisingly balanced, mentioning both the economic promises of Sterling Development and questions about the building's historical protection. Someone had leaked the story to a larger paper. That wasn't me, Emma said immediately. I know. I called them yesterday after you left. Thomas's expression was unapologetic. Emma, if you're going to fight this battle, you can't fight it alone in a closed room. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more people watching Monday night, the harder it will be for the council to play dirty. The bell above the diner door chimed. Emma glanced up to see Richard Voss entering, accompanied by two men in expensive coats she didn't recognize. His eyes found hers immediately, and the cold fury in them made her breath catch. He walked directly to their booth. Thomas, Emma. His voice was controlled, but barely. I see you're already spreading stories to the press, dragging our town's name through the mud for your 15 minutes of attention. Richard. Thomas's tone was pleasant. These gentlemen must be your investors from Boston. Welcome to Pembroke. One of the men, late 50s, silver hair, the bearing of someone used to being obeyed, stepped forward. Miss Hartley, I presume. I'm James Whitmore, principal investor in the Sterling project. I wonder if we might have a word. It wasn't really a question. Emma stood, her legs steadier than she expected. Of course. They moved to a corner booth away from curious ears. Whitmore's companion, younger, sharper-eyed, pulled out a leather portfolio. Miss Hartley, Whitmore began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. I understand you're passionate about your library. That's admirable. So let me make you an offer that serves everyone's interests. Sterling Development will not only build a new library in the shopping complex, we'll endow it with $500,000 for books, technology, and programming. We'll name it after your grandmother, the Ruth Hartley Memorial Library. You'll be appointed head librarian with a salary triple what you're making now. The offer hung in the air between them. More money than Emma had ever imagined. Her grandmother's name honored. The library not just saved, but elevated. All she had to do was walk away from the truth. And the current building? She asked. Demolished, as planned. But we'll salvage architectural elements. The oak desk, the original doors, the stained glass. Display them in the new library as historic artifacts. Artifacts of a building whose original purpose you want erased. Whitmore's smile thinned. Miss Hartley, I'm offering you a legacy, a chance to do more good than that crumbling building ever could. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish by being difficult? Emma thought of Josiah Pembroke's letter, his confession that the library was built on penance. She thought of the shipping manifests in Thomas's file box, the human lives reduced to cargo notation. She thought of Michael Chen's question, is someone trying to cheat? I'm hoping, she said carefully, to preserve the truth, even when it's inconvenient. The younger man leaned forward. Ms. Hartley, let me be frank. We've reviewed the property records. Your covenant is legally questionable. It's from an era when property law was significantly different, and we have attorneys who can argue it's not binding under modern statutes. We're offering you a graceful exit. Take it. Or we bury you in legal fees fighting a case you'll ultimately lose. And when we win, and we will win, there will be no new library, no endowment, no job. Just you unemployed in a town that will blame you for costing them economic opportunity. The threat was delivered with professional calm, but it was a threat nonetheless. Emma stood. Gentlemen, I appreciate your time, but I'm not interested in your offer. She walked back to Thomas, her heart hammering but her head high. Behind her, she heard Whitmore mutter something to Richard Voss, the tone ominous even if the words were unclear. That took courage, Thomas said when she sat down. That took stubbornness. I'm not sure it's the same thing. Oh, it usually is. That afternoon, Emma returned to the library to find a small crowd gathered outside. Her heart sank, expecting protesters. But as she approached, she recognized faces: Mrs. Kowalski from next door, Marcus Chen and his wife Lynn, Michael's parents, old Mr. Patterson, who'd been reading newspapers at the library every morning for 40 years, and a dozen others. "Emma," Mrs. Kowalski hurried forward. "We heard what you're doing, about the covenant, about trying to save the library. We wanted you to know you're not alone," Lin Chen added, her voice soft but firm. "This place, it saved Michael. When we first came to Pembroke 3 years ago, knowing almost no English, the library was where we learned to belong. You taught our son to read, to dream. We won't forget that." Marcus stepped forward, his mill worker's hands rough but gentle as he pressed an envelope into Emma's palm. "It's not much, $300, but it's what we can contribute to your legal defense if it comes to that." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I can't take your money." "You can, and you will," Mr. Patterson interrupted gruffly. "That library has been the heart of this town since before my grandfather was born. Some of us remember what matters." One by one, others pressed forward with envelopes, with words of encouragement, with promises to attend the council meeting Monday night. Not everyone in the crowd. Emma could see people hanging back, uncertain, worried about taking sides in a fight that might cost them. But enough people. Enough to remind her that she wasn't fighting alone. After they dispersed, Emma stood in the library's front entrance, looking at the stack of envelopes in her hands. Collectively, the community had scraped together nearly $2,000. Rent money, grocery money, savings from families who had almost nothing to spare. They were betting on her, on truth, on the idea that some things mattered more than money. She couldn't let them down. That evening, Emma worked late into the night, organizing her evidence, preparing her statement for the council meeting. She'd called a copy shop in Portland that morning, arranging to have Josiah's letter and the key shipping manifests professionally reproduced. The originals would stay secured with Thomas. At nearly midnight, she was startled by a knock at the back door. She opened it to find Michael Chen standing in the cold, his mother waiting in the car behind him. "Michael, what are you doing here so late?" He held out a folded piece of paper. "I made you something, for Monday, when you have to be brave." Emma unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing in colored pencil. The library, rendered in the hopeful, imperfect style of a 7-year-old. But around it, Michael had drawn dozens of stick figures with smiling faces, their hands linked in a circle around the building. At the bottom, in careful letters, "Miss Emma's helpers. We believe in you." The misspelling of believe only made it more precious. Emma knelt down and pulled the boy into a hug. "Thank you, sweetheart. This is the best gift anyone's ever given me." "Are you scared?" "Terrified." "But you're doing it anyway?" "Yes." Michael nodded solemnly. "That's what heroes do in books." After they left, Emma taped the drawing to the wall behind her desk, where she could see it while she worked. The circle of supporters, their hands linked. She wasn't fighting alone. But as she turned back to her documents, she didn't see the figure watching from across the street, or the camera recording her movements through the window. Richard Voss and his allies were preparing their own presentation for Monday night, one designed to destroy not just Emma's credibility, but her character. The battle was coming, and only one side could win. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything in Pembroke look like it belonged on a postcard. White church steeples against blue sky, snow-dusted pines, smoke rising from chimneys in lazy spirals. 24 hours until the council meeting. Emma stood in her small apartment above the library, staring at the clothes in her closet, with the bizarre awareness that what she wore tomorrow night would matter. Not legally, but psychologically. She was going to stand before the town council and call out powerful men for burying the truth. She needed to look like someone who couldn't be dismissed. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Never let them make you small, Emma. You take up space in this world, same as anyone else. She pulled out a navy suit she'd bought for job interviews in Boston, barely worn since she'd returned to Pembroke. It would have to do. The phone rang, the landline she'd installed in the apartment for emergencies. Only a handful of people had the number. Emma Hartley, she answered. Silence, then breathing. Hello? She tried again. A click. Deadline. The third such call since yesterday afternoon. No words, just silence and the sense of someone listening on the other end. Unsettling enough to make her hands shake as she hung up. Intimidation tactics. Clumsy ones, but effective nonetheless. She forced herself through the motions of Sunday. Coffee, toast she couldn't quite swallow. Reviewing her notes one more time. At 10 o'clock, she locked the apartment and headed to the library below. She'd promised Mrs. Kowalski she'd help set up for the afternoon's children's reading hour, one of the few normal things left in a week that had become surreal. The library felt different on Sundays, softer somehow, filled with families rather than solitary readers. Emma watched parents help children select books, saw toddlers sprawled on the reading rug, while Mrs. Kowalski animated voices for different characters. This was what she was fighting for. Not bricks and mortar, but the intangible magic of a space where everyone belonged. Michael arrived with his parents just after noon, clutching a library book he'd finished. He made a beeline for Emma. Miss Emma, I practiced my speech. Your speech? For tomorrow night. Mom said citizens can talk at council meetings. I'm going to tell them why the library matters. His face was serious, determined. Emma's heart clenched. Michael, sweetheart, that's very brave. But tomorrow might get difficult. Grown-ups might say things that don't seem fair. I know. But you're going to say true things. And true things are more important than easy things. 7 years old, and wiser than half the adults in this town. Lin Chen approached, her expression apologetic but resolved. Emma, I hope it's okay. Several families have decided to speak tomorrow. We've been organizing quietly. We thought, if enough voices stand with you, maybe the council will listen. Emma felt overwhelmed by gratitude and fear in equal measure. These families were putting themselves at risk, making themselves targets alongside her. Lynn, you don't have to do this. I don't want anyone to suffer consequences because of trying to do what's right. Lynn's smile was gentle but firm. Emma, my parents fled persecution in China. They taught me that silence in the face of injustice is its own form of violence. We speak tomorrow, or we teach our children that power always wins. That afternoon, Thomas Pembroke arrived at the library with a visitor, a woman in her 60s, African American, carrying herself with the kind of dignity that comes from surviving things others can't imagine. Emma, this is Dr. Constance Williams. She's a historian from Portland, specializes in New England's role in the slave trade. Dr. Williams extended her hand, her grip warm and strong. Mr. Pembroke called me yesterday. He shared copies of the documents you've uncovered. I came as soon as I could. They settled at the reference table, and Dr. Williams spread out her own research. Decades of documentation, about Maine's complicated relationship with slavery, the shipping companies that profited from human cargo, the families who'd built fortunes on suffering and then spent generations erasing the evidence. The Voss family isn't unique, she explained, her voice measured but passionate. What's unique is that you found primary source material, Josiah Pembroke's confession, the shipping manifests, the direct link between the fortune and its source. Most families destroyed this kind of evidence long ago. The fact that it survived here is extraordinary. Why? Emma asked. Why would Josiah preserve records that incriminated him? Because he understood something crucial, that redemption requires acknowledgement. You can't heal what you refuse to name. Dr. Williams pulled out a worn journal of her own. I've spent 30 years documenting these stories, fighting to make them part of the official historical record. Every town in New England has this shadow history, but most refuse to look at it directly. What you're doing tomorrow night, forcing Pembroke to confront its origins, that's revolutionary. Emma felt the weight of it settling deeper. Dr. Williams, what if I'm wrong? What if people aren't ready? What if bringing this up does more harm than good? The older woman looked at her with eyes that had seen too much injustice to be naive. Emma, the harm was done 200 years ago. You're just refusing to keep it buried. That's not the same thing. But the economic argument, sterling development is promising jobs, growth. I'm asking people to choose history over their livelihoods. No. Dr. Williams's voice was firm. You're asking them to build their future on truth instead of lies. Those are very different things. She paused, then added quietly. And between you and me, I've researched sterling development. They have a pattern. Come into economically depressed towns, promise jobs, get sweetheart deals on property, then build cheap structures that employ mostly outside contractors. 5 years later, the shopping centers are half empty and the towns are worse off than before. Whatever they're promising Pembroke, I'd bet my career it won't materialize the way they claim. Emma absorbed this, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. I'd like to attend tomorrow night, Dr. Williams said. If you'd be willing, I could speak as an expert witness about the historical significance of your findings. You'd do that? Emma, I've been waiting 30 years for someone like you. Someone willing to stand up and say the uncomfortable truths out loud. I'm not missing this. As evening fell, Emma walked through the library one more time, trailing her fingers along the shelves her grandmother had organized, the reading nooks where generations of children had discovered new worlds, the circulation desk worn smooth by decades of service. If she lost tomorrow, this would all be gone within months. Bulldozed, erased, replaced by something new and profitable and utterly soulless. But if she won, if she somehow, impossibly won, this building would stand as testimony, not just to what Pembroke had been, but to what it could choose to become. A town willing to face its history, acknowledge its debts, and move forward with integrity. The phone in her apartment rang again. She climbed the stairs, half expecting another silent intimidation call. Emma? The voice was familiar, Patricia Sterling, but stripped of its usual polish. I'm calling as a courtesy. Tomorrow night, the council is going to present evidence that you've been misappropriating library funds. Small amounts over the past 6 months, but documented. Photocopies, withdrawal records, all very official looking. Emma's blood went cold. That's a lie. I've never... Of course it's a lie. But it's a convincing lie. And Richard has friends at the bank who've helped construct the paper trail. By the time you prove it's fabricated, the council vote will be over, and your credibility will be destroyed. Why are you telling me this? Silence on the other end, long enough that Emma thought Patricia had hung up. Then quietly, because I have a daughter. She's 16, and she volunteers at the library every summer. Last night, she asked me how I could try to destroy the place that taught her to love reading. And I didn't have a good answer. Patricia, I'm not switching sides, Emma. I can't. I have investors, contracts, obligations, but I wanted you to be prepared. They're going to try to destroy you tomorrow before you can speak. Come armed with your own financial records, receipts, anything that proves you've been meticulous with the library's money. Thank you, Emma whispered. Don't thank me. I'm still going to vote to close the library. I'm trying to live with myself afterward. The line went dead. Emma stood holding the phone, her mind racing. They weren't just going to fight her evidence. They were going to attack her character, make her the villain before she could become the hero. She spent the next 3 hours pulling together every financial record she had. Bank statements, receipt books, expense reports going back 2 years. Her accounting was meticulous, thank God. Her grandmother had taught her that thoroughness was its own form of protection. At midnight, she finally allowed herself to sleep, though her dreams were full of courtrooms and crowds and the sound of a building collapsing. She woke at dawn, Monday, March 12th, 1984, the day everything would change. The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Emma, dressed in her navy suit, pinned her hair back in a way that made her look older, more authoritative. She packed 2 briefcases, one with the historical evidence, one with her financial records. Thomas arrived at noon with copies of everything, insurance against last-minute theft. Dr. Williams came at 2, reviewing the presentation with the precision of someone who'd testified before. At 5 o'clock, families began gathering outside the town hall. The Chens, Mrs. Kowalski, Mr. Patterson, and dozens of others. Some carried signs, "Save our library," and "History matters." Others simply came to witness. Emma stood across the street, watching the crowd grow, feeling the weight of their trust pressing down on her shoulders. Michael appeared at her elbow, dressed in his Sunday best, his hair carefully combed. "You look like a superhero," he said solemnly. "The kind that doesn't have powers but wins anyway." Emma smiled despite her terror. "What kind of superhero is that?" "The real kind." At 6:15, as the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Emma Hartley climbed the town hall steps, flanked by Thomas and Dr. Williams, followed by 24 citizens who decided that some battles were worth fighting, even when the outcome was uncertain. Inside, the council chamber was packed. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls. She saw Richard Voss conferring with his attorneys, saw Patricia Sterling studying her phone with studied disinterest, saw Mayor Pemberton looking deeply uncomfortable with the size of the crowd. And in the front row, she saw the investor James Whitmore, his expression cold and calculating, a man used to getting what he paid for. The gavel struck. The battle began. What Emma didn't know was that in the audience, a reporter from the Portland Press-Herald had brought a camera crew, and that this small-town council meeting was about to become something much larger, a referendum on truth itself. The council chamber smelled of old wood polish, nervous sweat, and the particular electricity that precedes moments when everything changes. Mayor Douglas Pemberton called the meeting to order at precisely 6:30. Emma sat in the front row, her briefcases at her feet, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. Michael sat beside her, his small hand finding hers and squeezing tight. Behind them, she could feel the presence of everyone who'd come to support her. Their hope, their fear, their trust. "We have a full agenda tonight," Mayor Pemberton began, his voice uncertain as he surveyed the packed room. "Item 7 is the vote regarding the Pembroke Public Library property disposition. However, before we reach that item, Councilman Voss has requested permission to present information relevant to the council's decision." Emma's stomach dropped. They were starting with the attack, trying to discredit her before she could speak. Richard Voss stood, a folder in his hands, his expression grave with practiced concern. "Mr. Mayor, council members, I take no pleasure in what I'm about to share, but as stewards of public funds, we have a responsibility to transparency." He moved to the presentation easel, pinning up photocopied bank statements. These documents show that over the past 6 months, Emma Hartley has systematically withdrawn small amounts from the library's operating budget. $20 here, $50 there. Individually insignificant, but collectively totaling just over $2,000. Money meant for books and programs, diverted for personal use. Gasps rippled through the audience. Emma felt Michael's hand tighten in hers. "That's not true," she said, her voice carrying despite her fear. "Those withdrawals were for legitimate expenses." "Then you'll have receipts," Richard interrupted smoothly. "Documentation of how that money was spent on library business?" Emma opened her second briefcase with hands that trembled only slightly. "I have receipts for every single transaction. Would you like them chronologically or by category?" She pulled out a meticulously organized binder, tabs marking different expense types. Richard's confidence flickered for just a moment. He hadn't expected her to be prepared. "The $20 on September 15th, Emma continued, standing and moving to the easel, was for art supplies for the children's autumn craft program. Here's the receipt from Morrison's Hardware. The $50 on October 3rd was for pizza and drinks for the teen reading group's Halloween party. Receipt from Gino's Pizzeria. Shall I continue?" She methodically addressed each misappropriated expense, producing receipts, photographs of the events, even thank you cards from children. With each piece of evidence, Richard's attack crumbled. "It appears," Mayor Pemberton said carefully, "that Ms. Hartley's accounting is in order. Councilman Voss, perhaps we should move on to... There's still the matter of unauthorized use of library resources," Richard pressed, desperation creeping into his voice. "Ms. Hartley has been conducting historical research on town time, using town property for personal projects. Researching the legal status of town property is hardly a personal project," Thomas Pembroke interrupted, standing from the audience. "And as a taxpayer, I'd argue it's exactly what we should want our librarian doing, protecting our assets." Applause broke out. Mayor Pemberton gavelled for order. "Perhaps," Patricia Sterling spoke up, her voice carefully neutral, "we should allow Ms. Hartley to present whatever findings she believes are relevant to the vote." Emma met Patricia's eyes across the room, saw the complex mixture of guilt and resolve there. This was as much help as Patricia could offer. A clean slate, a fair hearing. Emma stood, lifting her first briefcase onto the presenter's table. "Mr. Mayor, council members, citizens of Pembroke, I'm here tonight because I've discovered that the library building cannot legally be sold or demolished. It's protected by a perpetual covenant established by Josiah Pembroke in 1799. She presented the deed photographs from the county records, the legal language clear and unambiguous. Then she pulled out the reproduced letter, Josiah's confession to his son. But there's more to this story than property law. There's a question of why this covenant was buried, why it was forgotten, and what that forgetting has cost us. Emma's voice grew stronger as she read excerpts from Josiah's letter, the admission about the slave trade, the shipping company, the blood money that built Pembroke's prosperity. She watched faces in the audience shift from curiosity to shock to something harder: recognition. The Voss family has spent generations trying to erase this protection, Emma continued, because this building is a witness. It was built as confession, as penance, as a promise that future generations would have access to truth. And that's exactly what some people don't want. Richard Voss shot to his feet. This is slander. My family has served this town honorably for... Your grandfather buried the Covenant records in 1947, Emma interrupted, producing the notation from the county ledger. He marked it pending resolution, and then made sure it was never resolved. Why? What was he afraid people would learn? Dr. Constance Williams stood. Mr. Mayor, if I may? I'm Dr. Constance Williams, historian specializing in New England's role in the Atlantic slave trade. I've reviewed Ms. Hartley's findings, and they represent some of the most complete primary source documentation I've encountered. The shipping manifests alone. This is absurd. Richard's face had gone red. We're supposed to make economic decisions for this town's future based on ancient history that has nothing to do with us. Lin Chen stood, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. You want to erase the building that proves this town was built on suffering? You want to pretend your family's wealth just appeared out of nowhere, with no cost, no debt? My family doesn't owe anyone anything, Richard shot back. What happened 200 years ago has nothing to do with... It has everything to do with now. Michael Chen's voice, high and clear, silenced the room. He stood on his chair so everyone could see him. Miss Emma taught me that history is how we learn not to make the same mistakes. If we forget the bad parts, we can't learn from them. That's what she said. Out of the mouths of children. Emma felt tears threatening, but held them back. The Sterling Development Project isn't just about closing a library. It's about choosing between convenient lies and difficult truths. It's about whether we're willing to acknowledge that our prosperity has always come at someone's expense. James Whitmore rose from the front row, his voice smooth and dangerous. Ms. Hartley, are you seriously suggesting that this town should reject economic development, reject jobs, reject progress, all to preserve a building that reminds everyone of guilt they don't personally bear? That's not justice. That's self-flagellation. No, Dr. Williams countered. It's accountability. There's a difference. This is exactly the kind of divisive, guilt-focused rhetoric that holds communities back, Whitmore continued. Sterling Development offers a path forward, new opportunities, modern facilities, a library that serves 21st century needs instead of dwelling on 18th century sins. A library you'll control, Emma said quietly, located in a shopping center you own, funded by development deals that benefit your investors. Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, what happens when your profit margins don't support a free public library anymore? What happens when the lease comes up for renewal and you decide the space is worth more as retail? Whitmore's smile went cold. That's pure speculation. Is it? Emma pulled out one more document, something Dr. Williams had provided that morning. Because you did exactly that in 3 other Maine towns over the past decade. Promised community spaces, delivered for 5 years, then converted them to commercial use when it became more profitable. I have the documentation right here. The room erupted. Council members demanded to see the evidence. Whitmore's composure finally cracked, his veneer of civility giving way to naked fury. Mayor Pemberton gavelled for order, but the chaos only intensified. In the midst of it all, Patricia Sterling stood. "I'd like to make a motion," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. The room gradually quieted. "I move that we table the vote on the library property until a full historical review can be conducted, and until the town solicitor can provide a definitive legal opinion on the validity of Josiah Pembroke's covenant." Richard Voss stared at her, betrayed. "Patricia, you can't. We have contracts, investors. We have a potential legal quagmire that could cost this town millions. In litigation," Patricia replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "And we have evidence that our due diligence was inadequate. I'm not willing to put Sterling Development or this town at risk by proceeding hastily." "Second," said Councilwoman Mary Abbott, an elderly woman who'd been silent until now. "I remember my grandmother telling stories about the library, about how it was special, protected. Maybe we should have listened better to our elders." The vote to table was 4-2, only Richard Voss and his closest ally voting against. Emma felt the room spin. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was something. Time, space, a chance for truth to do its work. As the meeting adjourned, the crowd erupted in applause and argument in equal measure. Some rushed to congratulate Emma, others hurried out in anger. Michael hugged her waist fiercely, while his parents stood nearby with tears of relief. But Emma's eyes found Richard Voss, who stood alone near the council table, his face a mask of cold fury. He looked at her with such hatred that she felt it like a physical force. "This isn't over," he said quietly as he passed her. "I know," she replied. Outside, the March night had turned bitter cold. Emma stood on the town hall steps, wrapped in her coat, watching people disperse into the darkness. Some stopped to shake her hand, others avoided her gaze. The town was fractured now, divided in ways it hadn't been before. Thomas approached, his expression proud but worried. "You did well in there, but Emma, you need to understand. You've made powerful enemies. They won't just walk away. What can they do? The covenant is real. The evidence is documented. Legal battles can last years. They can drain your resources, your energy, your spirit. And even if you win, you'll have spent all that time fighting instead of living." He paused. "I just want you to know what you're choosing." Emma thought about that. The years of struggle ahead, the isolation, the cost of being right in a world that often punished integrity. Then she looked back through the town hall windows and saw Michael inside, carefully folding up the drawing he'd made for her, the one showing the library surrounded by supporters. "I'm choosing to be someone a 7-year-old can believe in," she said softly. "That's enough." As she walked back toward the library, Emma didn't see the figure watching from the shadows across the street, or the match that would be lit 3 hours later in the building's basement. Some people, when they can't win fairly, change the game entirely. The smoke alarm shrieked through Emma's apartment at 2:47 in the morning, dragging her from dreams of courtrooms and burning paper. She woke to the acrid smell of smoke. The library was on fire. Emma stumbled from bed, her mind still foggy with sleep, her body moving on instinct. She grabbed her phone, dialed 911 with shaking fingers, then ran to the apartment door. The hallway beyond was filling with gray, smoke, tendrils creeping up from the floor below like ghostly fingers. "Fire at Pembroke Public Library," she gasped to the dispatcher. "Eastern Hill Road. I'm in the apartment above. There's smoke everywhere. Get out of the building immediately, ma'am. Don't try to fight it. Get out now." But Emma was already moving down the stairs, her grandmother's voice in her head. The archive room. 2 centuries of records. Irreplaceable. The smoke was thicker on the main floor, stinging her eyes, burning her throat. She could see the orange glow from the basement stairs. The fire had started below, was working its way up. She had minutes at most. Emma ran to the archive room, wrapping her sweater around her face. Thomas's file box sat exactly where she'd left it. The shipping manifests, Josiah's original letter, all the primary sources that proved everything. She grabbed it, then swept her arms across the shelf, pulling down anything within reach. Town records, old photographs, the ledgers her grandmother had kept. The heat was building, the smoke so thick now she could barely see. The old building groaned around her, 200-year-old timbers beginning to surrender to flame. She stumbled toward the front entrance, her arms full of rescued history, her lungs screaming for clean air. The door burst open, firefighters in full gear pushing past her, shouting at her to get out, demanding to know if anyone else was inside. "Empty," she gasped. "Just me. The basement. Fire started in the basement." Hands guided her down the steps, away from the building. The cold March air hit her face like a benediction. She collapsed onto the lawn, coughing violently, the file box still clutched against her chest. Fire trucks had arrived, their lights painting the night in red and white. Hoses deployed, water arcing through the broken windows. Emma watched from her knees as flames consumed the building her grandmother had tended, the space that had sheltered generations of readers, the physical embodiment of Josiah Pembroke's penance. A paramedic tried to take the file box from her. She fought him with surprising strength. "Evidence," she choked out. "Criminal evidence, can't let go." Thomas arrived within minutes, still in his pajamas, his face stricken. He knelt beside her, gently taking the box from her arms. "I've got it, Emma. I've got it. Let them help you." Only then did she allow the paramedics to place an oxygen mask over her face, to check her vitals, to wrap a blanket around her shoulders. The fire chief, a man named Bill Morrison, no relation to Richard Voss, thank God, approached as dawn began to gray the eastern sky. "Miss Hartley, I need to ask you some questions. The fire started in the basement near the electrical panel. But here's the thing. I can smell accelerant. Someone used gasoline or something similar to make sure it caught." Emma's blood turned to ice despite the blanket. "Arson? That's what it looks like. We'll know more once the investigators go through it. But in my 20 years doing this, I know the smell of a deliberately set fire." He paused, his expression grim. "Given the timing, right after last night's council meeting, I'd say someone wanted to make damn sure this building came down one way or another." By 6 in the morning, half the town had gathered on Eastern Hill Road. Some came to help, forming bucket brigades before the professionals waved them back. Others came to watch, their faces showing everything from grief to grim satisfaction. And some came to bear witness, to see for themselves what hatred looked like when it ran out of patience. The Chens arrived with Michael, who burst into tears when he saw the smoke-blackened shell of the building. Lynn held him while Marcus approached Emma, his mill worker's hands gentle as he checked that she was okay. "Who would do this?" Michael sobbed. "Who would burn down the library?" Emma had no answer that a 7-year-old should have to hear. Mrs. Kowalski brought coffee and thermoses, blankets from her own home. Mr. Patterson stood silent vigil, his weathered face streaked with tears he didn't bother to hide. Dr. Williams, who'd stayed overnight at the Pembroke Inn, documented everything with her camera. The damage, the crowd, the raw emotion of a community watching its history burn. By 9 o'clock, the structural engineers had declared the building too dangerous to enter. Most of the main floor was destroyed, the archive room completely gone except for the few items Emma had rescued. The children's section, where Michael had learned to read, where countless others had discovered the magic of stories, was nothing but charred rubble and ash. 200 years of preservation erased in a single night. Richard Voss arrived at 9:30, accompanied by his attorney. He surveyed the damage with an expression that might have been regret, but looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Tragic, he said to no one in particular, but perhaps a blessing in disguise. The building was old, unsafe. This just accelerates what needed to happen anyway. Sterling Development's offer still stands. We can begin construction on the new facility immediately. Emma stood up from where she'd been sitting on the curb, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse from smoke, but carrying a fury that silenced conversations all around them. "You did this." Richard's expression went carefully blank. "That's a serious accusation, Ms. Hartley. I'd be very careful about making statements you can't prove. The fire started hours after you told me this wasn't over. After I exposed your family's attempts to bury the truth. After you realized you couldn't win fairly. I was home all night. I have witnesses. I'm sure you do. Money buys excellent alibis." Emma stepped closer, aware of the crowd gathering around them, of phones being raised to record. "But here's what you couldn't burn. The evidence. The shipping, manifests, Josiah's letter, the county deed records. They're safe, copied, documented, already sent to historians and legal experts. You can destroy the building, but you can't destroy the truth." Richard's composure cracked, just for a moment. "You self-righteous. You have no idea what you've done to this town. The divisions you've created, the opportunities you've cost us." "The divisions were already there," Thomas interrupted, stepping forward. Emma just refused to keep pretending they didn't exist. Fire Chief Morrison approached, his expression grave. "Mr. Voss, I'm going to need you to come down to the station. We have some questions about your whereabouts last night, and about who might have had keys to the building." "This is ridiculous. I'm calling my lawyer." "Already here," the attorney said smoothly. "Chief Morrison, my client will cooperate fully. But these accusations are inflammatory and unsupported." As they argued, Emma felt the adrenaline that had sustained her finally giving way. Her legs buckled. Thomas caught her before she fell, guiding her to sit on the curb again. "You need rest," he said gently. "Medical attention. You breathed in a lot of smoke. I need to figure out what happens next. What happens next is you let other people carry this for a while." Patricia Sterling approached hesitantly, her usual polish replaced by something that looked like genuine distress. She held out a business card. "This is my personal attorney. Criminal defense, best in the state. Whatever happens with the investigation, you're going to need protection. I'll cover the fees." Emma stared at her. "Why?" "Because my daughter asked me this morning if I helped burn down the library." Patricia's voice cracked. "She's 16 years old, and she asked her own mother if she was capable of destroying something children loved. I couldn't. I can't." She stopped, composed herself. "I'm withdrawing Sterling Development from the project. Whatever happens with this property, we won't be involved. Your investors can sue me if they want. Some things matter more than profit." Patricia looked at the smoking ruins. "I just wish I'd remembered that before it came to this." The investigation moved quickly once the fire marshal's team combed through the debris. They found the remains of 3 5-gallon gas cans in the basement, placed strategically to maximize damage. Security footage from the hardware store showed someone matching Richard Voss's build, purchasing those exact cans 2 days earlier, paying cash, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. But the real break came from an unexpected source. Tyler Voss, Richard's 16-year-old son, walked into the police station at 3 o'clock that afternoon with his mother. The boy was crying, his words tumbling out in a confession that would unravel everything. He'd heard his father on the phone the night of the council meeting, arranging payment for someone to take care of the problem. He'd watched his father leave the house at 2 in the morning, return at 3, shower immediately, and burn his clothes in the fireplace. Tyler had been too afraid to speak up until he'd gone to school that morning and heard his classmates, Michael Chen among them, crying about the library. "I thought he was just going to scare her or something," Tyler sobbed. "I didn't know he'd actually. Dad said it was just an old building, that nobody really cared. But they do care. And now Miss Hartley could have died. And I can't. I can't keep pretending I don't know." Richard Voss was arrested at 6 o'clock that evening on charges of arson, reckless endangerment, and attempted destruction of historical property. The state police, brought in to avoid conflicts of interest with local officials, also opened an investigation into evidence tampering related to the library's financial records. Emma watched the news coverage from the hospital, where she'd finally been admitted for smoke inhalation and exhaustion. The story had exploded beyond Pembroke. Every major Maine newspaper, plus Boston and New York outlets, were covering it. The narrative had shifted from small-town library dispute to corrupt official attempts to destroy evidence of families' slave-trading past. Dr. Williams appeared on several news programs, carefully explaining the historical significance of what had been at stake. Thomas gave interviews emphasizing Josiah Pembroke's intention that the library serve as moral testimony, and somehow, improbably, the story became bigger than one town's politics. It became a question of how we remember, what we preserve, and who gets to decide which truths matter. Michael visited Emma in the hospital on her second day, bringing a new drawing, the library, phoenix-like, rising from ashes. Around it, the same circle of stick figures, their hands linked. "Mr. Thomas says we can rebuild it," Michael told her seriously. "He says lots of people are sending money to help, people from all over." Emma pulled the boy into a gentle hug, careful of her IV line. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Will you still be the librarian when it's rebuilt? If the town still wants me." "We want you," Michael said with absolute certainty. "You're the hero who saved the history." On her 4th day in the hospital, Emma received an unexpected visitor. James Whitmore, the Boston investor, stood in her doorway looking significantly less polished than he had at the council meeting. "Ms. Hartley, I won't take much of your time. I just wanted to apologize." Emma studied him warily. "For assuming you were just an obstacle to manage. For not doing my due diligence on Richard Voss or the property's history. He paused, something like shame crossing his features. "For forgetting that some things actually do matter more than return on investment. Mr. Whitmore, you tried to bribe me to stay silent about a historically protected building and evidence of slavery. I did, and I'll have to live with that." He set an envelope on her bedside table. "This is a check for $500,000, made out to the Pembroke Library Restoration Fund. It doesn't make up for anything, but it's what I can offer. No strings, no conditions. Just a man trying to do one right thing after a series of very wrong ones." After he left, Emma opened the envelope with shaking hands. The check was real. Thomas arrived an hour later with more news. The governor had announced a state historical preservation grant for the library's reconstruction. The National Trust for Historic Preservation had designated it a site of national significance. Donations were pouring in from across the country, from people who'd read the story and decided that this one small library mattered. "We're going to rebuild," Thomas said, his eyes bright with tears. "Better than before, exactly where it stood, with the original covenant engraved in stone at the entrance. Josiah's confession, the full truth, available for anyone to read." Emma felt something break open in her chest. Grief for what was lost, hope for what could be created, exhaustion from the battle, and pride in having fought it anyway. "Thomas, will the town forgive me for dividing them?" "Some will, some won't. But Emma, you didn't divide them. You revealed divisions that already existed. The difference is now they're visible, which means we can actually try to heal them." That night, alone in her hospital room, Emma looked out at the Pembroke skyline and thought about courage, consequence, and the price of speaking truth to power. The library was gone, but the story it represented, the debt acknowledged, the penance offered, the hope for redemption, that would live on. And sometimes, that was enough. The reconstruction of Pembroke Public Library began on June 1st, 1984, with a groundbreaking ceremony attended by 300 people, nearly half the town's population. 18 months had passed since the fire. Emma stood beside Thomas and Dr. Williams, watching as the first shovel broke ground on the same granite foundation that had supported the building for 2 centuries. The original oak circulation desk, one of the few pieces salvaged from the fire, sat under a protective tarp nearby, waiting to be restored and reinstalled. Michael Chen, now 8 years old and reading at a 10th grade level, had been given the honor of burying a time capsule beneath the cornerstone. Inside were copies of Josiah Pembroke's letter, newspaper articles about the fire and its aftermath, Tyler Voss's handwritten apology to the town, and drawings from 17 children showing what the library meant to them. "Miss Emma," Michael said as they covered the capsule with earth, "do you think people 100 years from now will understand why this mattered so much?" Emma knelt beside him, her hands still bearing faint scars from that night she'd run through smoke to save history. "I think they'll understand that some people chose truth over comfort, and that's always worth remembering." The past 18 months had transformed Pembroke in ways both visible and invisible. Richard Voss was serving a 7-year sentence for arson and evidence tampering. His wife had divorced him, taken back her maiden name, and moved with Tyler to Portland, where the boy could start fresh. Tyler wrote to Emma occasionally, letters full of teenage awkwardness and genuine remorse, asking questions about history and responsibility and how you lived with your family's mistakes. She always wrote back. Patricia Sterling had indeed withdrawn from the development project, taking a significant financial loss that her investors had not forgiven. But she'd used the experience to redirect her company toward historic preservation and adaptive reuse. Her daughter Sarah volunteered at the temporary library space every weekend and had been accepted to college with plans to study public history. The temporary library, housed in the old Methodist church that closed in the 1970s, had become a surprising success. Emma ran it with a skeleton staff and an army of volunteers, maintaining services while the permanent building was reconstructed. If anything, attendance had increased. People who'd never used the library before came out of solidarity, curiosity, or the dawning realization that they'd taken it for granted until it was almost gone. Thomas Pembroke had donated a significant portion of his personal savings to the Reconstruction Fund. along with his entire collection of Pembroke family documents. "They belong to the town," he'd said simply. They always did. Dr. Constance Williams had spent 6 months in Pembroke, conducting the most thorough historical documentation of the town's role in the slave trade ever undertaken. Her research had uncovered 17 families whose wealth originated in the shipping business, not just the Vosses. Some of those families had responded with denial, others with acknowledgement, a few with genuine efforts at reparative action. The town had established a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, modeling it after similar efforts in other communities confronting historical injustices. It was messy, painful, progress measured in inches rather than miles. But it was happening. Emma had been named head librarian officially, with a salary funded by a permanent endowment that Thomas and several anonymous donors had established. She'd also been invited to speak at library conferences across New England, telling the story of how one building's near destruction had sparked a regional conversation about preservation, truth-telling, and the role of public institutions in holding communities accountable to their past. She remained, at heart, the same quiet person she'd always been. But quiet, she'd learned, didn't mean powerless. The new library rose through the summer and fall of 1985, built by a construction company from Portland that specialized in historic reconstruction. They'd studied photographs, architectural drawings, the memories of elderly residents who'd known the building in its prime. The result would be both faithful to the original and updated for modern use. The same bones, but with better heating, accessibility ramps, fire suppression systems that would have saved it the first time. Emma walked through the construction site weekly, watching walls rise, windows installed, shelves built to the exact specifications her grandmother had used. The contractor, a woman named Sarah Okonkwo, whose own family had fled Nigeria during the Civil War, understood the weight of what they were building. "This isn't just a library," Sarah said one October afternoon as they stood in the framed-out children's section. "It's a promise that will tell the truth even when it hurts, that will protect the vulnerable even when it costs us, that will build something that outlasts our own lifetimes." "That's a lot of weight for one building to carry," Emma observed. "Good thing it's built on granite, then." On December 15, 1985, 21 months after the fire, Pembroke Public Library reopened. The ceremony was simple but profound. Mayor Pemberton, who'd narrowly survived a recall election and emerged chastened but still in office, read Josiah Pembroke's letter aloud in its entirety. Dr. Williams spoke about the importance of institutions that preserve uncomfortable truths. Lin Chen, representing the library's supporters, talked about sanctuary and second chances. But it was Michael who brought down the house. The boy stood at the podium, barely tall enough to see over it, and spoke in the clear voice of someone who'd learned that courage was contagious. 2 years ago, I asked Miss Emma where I would go if the library closed. And she didn't just tell me it would be okay. She fought to make sure it was okay. She taught me that one person standing up for what's right can change everything. That history matters because it teaches us who we are and who we want to be. And that libraries aren't just about books, they're about belonging. He looked directly at Emma, his eyes bright behind his glasses. "Thank you for teaching me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you're scared, and you do it anyway." The audience erupted in applause. Emma, standing to the side with Thomas and Mrs. Kowalski, felt tears streaming down her face. After the ceremony, people poured into the new building. Children raced to claim spots in the reading nooks. Adults ran their hands along the restored oak circulation desk, marveling at how solid it felt. How permanent. Mr. Patterson settled into his usual chair by the newspapers, his weathered face peaceful. Emma watched from her position behind the circulation desk, her grandmother's position, now hers by right of inheritance and battle, and felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, but something close. The satisfaction of knowing she'd fought for something worth preserving, and won. That evening, after the crowds had gone and the building was quiet, Emma walked through the empty library one final time before locking up. The children's section smelled of new carpet and fresh paint. The archive room, rebuilt with climate control and proper preservation systems, held not just the rescued documents, but new acquisitions from families who'd been inspired to donate their own historical records. The reference section included a new shelf, Pembroke History, the full story, with books on slavery, the Underground Railroad in Maine, reparations, and truth-telling. On the wall beside the circulation desk hung a framed photograph. Emma's grandmother, Ruth Hartley, standing in this same spot in 1948, her hands resting on the oak desk with proprietary pride. Beside it now hung a second photograph, Emma herself on the night of the fire, smoke-stained and exhausted, clutching the file box of rescued documents to her chest. Legacy in 2 frames. As Emma locked the front door and stepped into the December cold, she saw a figure waiting on the sidewalk. Thomas, bundled in his winter coat, his breath fogging in the lamplight. "Thought you might like company for the walk home," he said. They walked in comfortable silence through the quiet streets, past houses decorated for Christmas, past the town square where a plaque now acknowledged Pembroke's role in the slave trade. The marker had been controversial. Many had argued it would hurt tourism, damage the town's reputation, drive away business. But the Truth and Reconciliation Committee had insisted, and eventually the council had agreed. Some wounds needed to be named before they could heal. "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked as they paused at the corner. "The fight, the cost, everything you went through." Emma thought about the question carefully. She'd lost friends over this, had been threatened and maligned, had literally run through fire. The scars on her hands ached when the weather changed. She still sometimes woke at night smelling smoke. But she also thought about Michael Chen, confident and curious, teaching himself French from library books because he'd decided he wanted to travel the world someday. About Tyler Voss, finding redemption through honest accounting of his family's past. About the 17 other families who'd begun their own reckoning with history. About Sarah Sterling, passionate about preservation in ways her mother never was. "No," Emma said finally. "I don't regret it. I just wish it hadn't been necessary." "That's the difference between cynicism and hope," Thomas observed. "Cynics believe the fight was inevitable. Hopeful people wish it hadn't been, but fight anyway." They parted at Emma's new apartment. She'd found a place 2 blocks from the library, a small space above a bakery that smelled like bread every morning. As she succeeded to climb the stairs, Emma heard her phone ringing. It was Dr. Williams calling from her office in Portland. "Emma, I wanted you to be the first to know. The book is finished. The Complete History of Pembroke and the Atlantic Slave Trade. It's being published by Yale University Press next fall." "Constance, that's wonderful." The dedication reads, "For Emma Hartley, who taught us that librarians are keepers of uncomfortable truths, and that sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that change everything." After they hung up, Emma stood at her window looking out at Pembroke's winter skyline. The library's lights were visible on Eastern Hill Road, a beacon in the darkness. Tomorrow, children would come through those doors looking for stories and safety. Adults would come seeking knowledge and community. People from away would come to learn about what happened here. The crime, the cover-up, the confrontation, the costly path toward truth. And Emma would be there, behind the circulation desk, doing what librarians had always done, connecting people with the information they needed, protecting the vulnerable, preserving the past so the future could learn from it. Some battles ended in fire. This one had ended in rebuilding. And that, Emma thought as she finally let herself rest, was the most powerful kind of victory. Not destruction of your enemies, but creation of something better than what existed before. Epilogue. The library still stands on Eastern Hill Road, exactly where Josiah Pembroke built it in 1799. If you visit today, you can see his letter engraved on a granite monument beside the entrance, every word of his confession preserved in stone. The circulation desk is original, worn smooth by centuries of hands, including Emma's grandmother's and Emma's own. Emma Hartley served as head librarian until her retirement in 2020, a tenure of 36 years. She never married, though she was loved by thousands. The children she taught, the families she served, the truth seekers who made pilgrimage to this small Maine town to see what happens when one person refuses to stay silent. Michael Chen went on to become a civil rights attorney, arguing cases before the Supreme Court. He keeps one of Emma's early book recommendations on his desk. To Kill a Mockingbird, inscribed with her handwriting. For Michael, who asked the right questions. Keep asking them. The Pembroke Truth and Reconciliation Committee continues its work, a model for other communities confronting difficult histories. It's messy, incomplete, imperfect, but it exists, which is more than most towns can claim. And sometimes, late at night when the library is closed and the streets are empty, people say you can smell lemon oil and old paper drifting from the building on Eastern Hill Road. They say if you press your hand against the oak circulation desk, you can feel the warmth of all the hands that came before. Librarians and readers, truth-tellers and truth-seekers, every person who understood that some things are worth preserving even when the cost is high. But that might just be legend, or it might be the kind of truth that can't be proven, only felt. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to remember that quiet voices can change the world. Because the best stories, the ones that matter most, are the ones that remind us what we're capable of when we refuse to stay silent. They say Emma Hartley's ghost still walks the library stacks on winter nights, straightening books and leaving reading recommendations on the circulation desk for the morning staff. The current librarian, Michael Chen's daughter, swears she found a note once, in handwriting that matched the inscriptions in decades-old books. Keep asking the right questions. Keep telling the truth. That's what libraries are for.